Hello and welcome. This is the final panel of our day of Foreign Policy by Canadians, Global Public Health. And some of you will have been on all 5 of our previous panels, in which case, congratulations for sticking with us. And some of you will have picked and chosen. Either way, we're very happy to have you here. This is not only the final discussion of the day, but also the bridge to the rest of the exercise. And so I will spend a little time at the beginning of this describing how we're going to try and achieve impact in Canada's foreign policy debate using the method that we've selected, which is deliberative democracy. And then we'll turn to the expert from the center that we've taken on as our partner for this to explain how this works. Before turning to our global public health policy experts. But let me start with a round of introductions so you know who else you're looking at on this Zoom screen. So I'm Ben Rowswell, the President and Research Director of the CIC, which is an organization that gives citizens a voice in global affairs. We're present in 17 cities across the country. I'm calling you from Toronto today, which is where our national headquarters is located. I'm joined today by Alice Hsu, who is at Stanford University and will be speaking first. She's the Assistant Director of the Center on Deliberative Democracy. She also has her bachelor's, master's, and PhDs from Stanford, bachelor's in political science, master's in economics and public policy, and then a PhD, I presume, with Jim Fishkin, who is the inventor of deliberative democracy, because it's a PhD in political communication, deliberative democracy, and public opinion. Alice has been instrumental in delivering deliberative democracy exercises in a wide variety of countries already. And it always surprises me the diversity of the countries in which this method is attempted. Developing countries, developed countries, all kinds of languages, all kinds of regions of the world. So she might be able to offer us some perspectives on how this differs, whether you're in Brazil, China, Argentina, most recently Japan, the European Union, and I believe she was involved in one that's just completed, an online one in Chile. And so now striking out into the hopefully a little bit more familiar environment of Canada. And she'll be talking to us about the method itself of deliberative democracy. Next, we have Rougine Habibi, who is with York University, an expert in global public health, and recently selected as a CIC fellow. We're very pleased to have not only Rougine's contributions as a fellow of CIC, by which she engages in the public debate by bringing complex public policy issues to Canadian citizens through the events and publications that we organize in the CIC, but she's also signed on for a particular work that we're doing on deliberative democracy to be the drafter of the guide that will eventually bring regular citizens up to speed on global public health issues for their participation in the deliberative democracy exercise. So she joins us as well from Toronto. Then we'll turn to Val Percival, who is a former CIC fellow, but an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, so joining us from Ottawa. Val was a bachelor's student here at the University of Toronto, or here in the city of Toronto, did her master's at Carleton, and then got her doctorate in public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's had quite an international career herself, working at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Guinea. She was the director of the Kosovo office for the International Crisis Group, has worked for our foreign ministry in Ottawa, in the Department of Global Affairs, then known as the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And in addition to her work at NIPSI at Carleton, she serves on the Commission on Peace, Justice, and Gender Equality for Healthy Societies, overseen by the Lancet magazine, and the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation. And last but certainly not least, because she was high enough caliber that we actually called on her expertise twice today, and that's Dr. Nilima Gulrajani, who is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, which of course is a London-based development think tank, but we've been lucky enough to have her here in Toronto with us over the last year and a half as a visiting fellow at the CIC. She's also a visiting fellow for the department, a visiting fellow for the Department of International Development, which, as many of you know, has been absorbed into the Foreign Ministry of the United Kingdom. She's been doing a lot of public commentary on the link between foreign policy and development assistance, and is a visiting fellow also at the G20 Research Center at the University of Toronto. So that's our lineup for this final panel, the subject of which is how to take these complex policy debates that we've been having over the course of the day, and that all countries have been having over the course of this pandemic, and bring them to citizens in a way that citizens can make an informed judgment and decisions about the more serious attention our government should be bringing to global health policy. We have been reminded by the 10,000 plus Canadians that have now died of COVID, the devastation in our economy, the worst impact since the Great Depression, that we don't have the luxury of ignoring global public health issues. They will come to find us if we don't pay attention to them. And I can tell you, as someone who's practiced Canadian foreign policy for more than 25 years, global health policy does not occupy a very prominent role traditionally in foreign policy discussions. I know that because the only time that I really had any involvement myself in global public health policy was as a brand new minted officer in the UN division back in the 1990s, when my hair was not this color. And I had the responsibility to generate instructions for the Canadian delegation at the World Health Organization at all of about 23 years old, with absolutely no background in health. And the only reason it fell to me was, I believe, it was not taken as a very serious area of Canadian foreign policy. It was sort of delegated to the brand new, wet behind the ears diplomats. I hope that's not the case. I'm no longer in the Department of Global Affairs, so I can't pass judgment on how they allocate their files right now. But back in the 1990s, I think that was a sign that it wasn't a particularly high profile area of Canadian foreign policy. That must change, it seems to me, in an era where pandemics are causing such devastation. And yet making the case to Canadians is not going to be easy. Priorities change. There's only a fixed amount of resources to spend. So we thought it would be useful to include global public health in this attempt to reset Canadian foreign policy or reframe foreign policy by demonstrating the relevance of foreign policy to individual Canadians. But how we do that and how we frame the debate so that we get an objective and honest read from the Canadian people about the relative importance will take some skill and some finesse. I will stop there. Happy to take any questions once we have the discussion going, and please feel free to use either the Q&A field or the chat field here in the Zoom webinar. But with that introduction, let me turn to Alice Sue for an explanation of this unique method that has been developed at Stanford University and that we've adopted for this project of foreign policy by Canadians. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. I'm excited to be here on the panel, and also excited to start this journey with everyone. And it's exciting to be specifically talking about, or being on the panel about, global public health, especially with everything that's been said. It's such an important issue now. And from where I am, as you can see from the background, we're interested in dealing with all sorts of issues from the aspect of deliberative democracy. And what's important in understanding deliberative democracy is, in the heart of it is deliberation, which the root of the word is weighing opinions. And what we're interested in is really allowing the public to weigh the pros and cons of certain issues. And today we're talking about public health. What are the important ones on one side? What are the important ones on the other? And when we talk about this, it seems like something that is very fundamental and easy to understand. But oftentimes when we get into issues that we may not have thought about or may not have discussed, we find it hard to come up with good, strong, convincing arguments. And what's worse at times is we don't venture out to really get a good spread of the spectrum of arguments that are available. And I think through the process of deliberative polling that we will be assisting with is really getting a large breadth of what exactly the issues are and what are the arguments that accompany them, and allowing the public to really engage and wrestle with these issues. I think that's what's most important and most key and fundamental about deliberation. The process we'll be engaging with will include surveys and discussions and interactions with experts with Q&A. But the heart of the process is within those small group discussions where people will interact with each other, where average citizens will interact with each other and understand what each other's experiences are on public health, on global public health. They will bring their own anecdotes, they will bring their own expertise. And what's important here is having a shared sense of what the basic understanding of what we're presenting about public health is. And this is where the panel is so important, because we need to get a sense of what are the most important policies and proposals we should be talking about with respect to health. And within those, what are some of the key proposals that the public should wrestle with? What should we bring to them to allow them to have these discussions that could inform all of us here and inform the government and policymakers who may not know what the public is really thinking. Oftentimes when we talk about issues that we don't really know about. We're really excited about having this opportunity to work with everyone here to have us understand as well what are we trying to allow the public to discuss and debate about? What information do they critically need to know to make certain types of certain types of opinions? And we're excited to be a part of this process. I know there will be questions later on, but sharing that a bit about the process itself. And as Ben said, we've been doing this all around the world in 30 countries and jurisdictions, tackled a number of different issues from the economy and healthcare to solar panel installations, and most recently constitutional issues in Iceland and Mongolia. And so we've dealt with a variety of issues, but all of which the commonality is that we present participants with balanced and accurate and vetted information. And within that information are details and arguments and background that is crucial for having a very informed discussion. So with that, I'll leave it to the next speaker.
All right, thank you, Alice. I do encourage those of you that are attending to prepare some questions for Alice. It's rare that we get an opportunity to talk to someone who's an expert in deliberative democracy, so please do hold forth. We've got CIC branches online that will be organizing other thematic discussions as well on other aspects of foreign policy by Canadians. So with that, I'll turn to Regine, who has the unenviable task, I think, of trying to boil down such a complex public policy field to a guide that can be prepared for citizens in a way that equips them to do that weighing of options. As Alice pointed out, the etymology of deliberation being weighing of options. She's brand new in the process, having agreed to take this on just a few days ago, but she will be sharing some initial thinking about how to frame the debate and what kind of key trade-offs or key questions might be put to citizens for that weighing process. Over to you, Regine.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you, Alice, for introducing this exercise, which I'm so excited that we get to apply to the field of global public health as a matter of foreign policy. It's this is groundbreaking work, I think, right here in Canada. And so I'm really excited that we're getting to develop this sort of discipline and thinking around what do Canadians want to see their government push as a global health agenda. So I think I'd like to structure this reflection first by thinking about 4 key dimensions of engagement in global public health. And these are sort of 4 key interlinked dimensions, and they build on one another. So in addition to the information that citizens receive in order to decide on what policy proposals are most suited to the Canadian populace, I think it's important to think about sort of the underlying, the underpinnings of those policy proposals. And this, as an early starting to reflection, I boiled down to, I guess, 4 key areas. So rationale, objectives, modalities, and scope. Modalities and scope, and resources, and long-term sustainability. And I just thought I'd initiate these reflections by just diving right into rationale, which is probably the thing we need to think most about. And I guess in terms of rationale, there's 3 reasons for which we'd want to see Canada engaging in global public health. So from this, we can have perhaps the most intuitive rationale for engaging in this as a matter of foreign policy is just pure self-interest. So interest for the safety and well-being of Canadians. Nothing has revealed this more starkly, the importance of engaging in global public health in COVID-19, when we can see that a disease threat, a health threat that's purely emerging in another country can reach our shores within a matter of hours in today's interconnected world. And it's important here to think about what health threats, what global health threats are we excluding from this kind of rationale for engaging in global public health? For instance, we're talking here primarily of human-to-human diseases which transmit from human to human. We're not here capturing non-communicable diseases that wouldn't form part of a global health agenda that's motivated purely by self-interest and by interest of our own national security. Another rationale for becoming engaged is something that sort of builds on self-interest, which we could think about as enlightened self-interest. And this is generally just the idea that we benefit from strengthening the populations of countries abroad, because they become then stable countries for us in terms of partners in other sectors. So partners in trade, their strong economies are good for us as well. We should want the international community to be as coordinated as possible on issues of global health, because, for instance, that can foster innovation and research more quickly. We can better understand evidence-based policy interventions if other countries' research capacities are strengthened. And Canada also benefits from generally peaceful relations, and peaceful relations emerge when countries, when there's human prosperity and progress. And this is the underpinning of Canada's current feminist international assistance policy. At least it's one of the underpinnings of it. And it's also the premise of the United Nations itself that emerged from the Second World War was that human prosperity and progress would ensure peace in the long term and avoid us getting into the scourge of war. But there's often a rationale that maybe it could be, you could say that it's maybe implied, or perhaps it's not articulated as much, but it's simply the concern for human dignity and the moral imperatives for becoming engaged in global public health. We have this idea of global citizenship and the right to health of every individual that countries around the world have agreed to. The right to health is embedded within the Constitution of the World Health Organization, to which nearly every country in the world is a party. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights articulates this in its own way. And so I'd be very interested to know, through the Citizens' Deliberative Democracy exercise, how much this idea resonates with the Canadian public intuitively, with us as Canadians, and with what we'd like to see our government do. And then from there, just moving into objectives. So this connects to our rationale. We need to look at our objectives. Are we looking to achieve strictly a healthier world for Canadians? Relates again to what rationale we're using for engagement in global public health. Maybe a healthier world for all, maybe a safer world for all, and how about a just world? So these are things that the very broad strokes and qualitative of observations of objectives we want to have from our global public health engagement, but it's important to sort of have a clear-minded view of that. And then from there, delving into modalities and scope, it's important to bear in mind that global health is a vast field. Within the global health community, what we talk about as being part of global health is not just those acute determinants of health. So things like hospitals, access to hospitals, healthcare, doctors, treatments, but also the things that are the underlying causes of poor health. So access to proper or quality education, adequate standard of living, the ability to have a job that makes enough income for you to live a decent life. And those are the things that Canada's international, and we've heard Minister Gould talk about this, Canada's development international assistance policy currently prioritizes, but it may not be necessarily articulated within the global health lingo and framework, and within a results framework of health impact. And within in terms of modalities, I just want to stress something that's, I think it's pretty important, to not view global health as simply giving assistance to other countries. So global health it should be viewed as something broader, as diplomacy, our engagement with these multilateral forums, not just the World Health Assembly, but multilateral forums around the world that have an impact on population health. In defining the scope of Canada's engagement in global public health, we also need to think about what we are doing back home to make sure the world is safe and secure. So there's nothing to stop, for instance, an emerging disease from appearing right here within Canada. And how are we fixing our own healthcare systems, our own what are our own health policies to make sure that we're not the source of the next pandemic? Antimicrobial resistance right now is huge. It's a huge issue for every single country in the world, and it's something that every country bears responsibility to fix. Same thing with climate change. And so these are collective threats that imperil the world, that every country has a responsibility to bear, including Canada. So not thinking simply about helping other countries, it's also about taking a hard look in the mirror and helping ourselves as well to help others. And just ending here quickly on resources and sustainability, I think building on those three aspects of rationale, objectives, and modalities and scope, it becomes clear whether our resources are commensurate with what Canadians view as being important to engage in a global health agenda. And I'll let Nilima, I think I'll be very interested to hear from her how much we've put up as resources in potentially, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic. But certainly among OECD countries, from what I've heard, Canada's not necessarily a leader in putting up resources as a proportion of its gross national income. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to you, Ben. And thanks so much.
Thank you. We will hear from Nilima shortly. Nilima outlined some data that came out, some research that she led earlier in our 11 o'clock panel, which is available in video form if you want to have more detail, but we'll ask for her reaction shortly. But first, I'd like to go to Val Percival at Carleton University with some reactions to the initial sense of how we might frame this discussion guide and what elements we should also be thinking about. Over to you, Val.
So thank you very much, Ben, and thanks Alice and Rogine for really interesting reflections. And I think Rogine had such a comprehensive list of how we should look at global health, that what I might do is apply perhaps a little more critical lens. So I think one of the reasons why deliberative democracy and engagement with Canadians is so important is because Canada needs to do better on global health. I think there is this feeling that the COVID-19 pandemic was inevitable. It was a new virus. We didn't have treatment. We didn't have vaccines. And so it was inevitable that it would have the social and economic impact, not only in Canada, but around the world. But what we know now is that many countries have done much better than Canada. And Canada spends an enormous amount of resources. It has great human capital. It's got strong bureaucratic expertise, but none of it seemed to work particularly well to prevent this onslaught of COVID-19. And while we have definitely fared better than our neighbors to the south and some European countries, I think that if you compare us to countries in Asia, we have not fared particularly well. And I think that through engaging Canadians to demand better of the government and understand the dimensions of global health and understand that it's not inevitable, we can push for some sort of reset. You know, there's a lot of discussion within the international community about a COVID reset and an opportunity for us to engage in our development programming, our international assistance, our social assistance, address inequities. And this was discussed in the earlier panel by Rosemary, Jocelyn, and Julia. And I think that the more that Canadians understand about global health, understand that pandemics like COVID are not necessarily inevitable, that they can be controlled with proper leadership, the better will be. So I would argue that currently Canadian global leadership on Canadian government leadership on global health has been impeded by a lack of vision, poor interdepartmental coordination, very thin-skinned aversion to criticism, and the lack of engagement with a broad network of global health experts, both within Canada and without. Frankly, we can't afford that anymore. And so I would argue that as part of this reset, we really need, and the deliberative democracy exercise might be an avenue to this, we really need a strong vision, like Roisin mentioned, about what Canada's place is in the world, how we will engage in global health, and what our objectives will be. We need a better understanding of the structures of governance that are important. This sounds boring, but bureaucracies matter. And right now we see Canada engages in global health primarily through its development programs. There's no comprehensive global health strategy that's nimble, and there's insufficient bureaucratic resources with expertise to execute that strategy. Resources, again, are the resources that are allocated to global health sufficient, and are they allocated in the right way? Diplomacy, how are we doing in terms of diplomatic engagement? So I would be really interested in finding out what Canada was doing at the World Health Assembly this past summer. I looked on WHO's website and I couldn't find Canada's WHA statement. These are places where Canada's engagement matters and we can push the needle. And then I'd just like to do another call out for networks. So one of the things that has been really clear in the COVID response has been the power of scientific networks in driving cooperation. We heard from Rosemary Morgan about the work that she's doing on the COVID and Gender Network, and that's a Google group. And so this is not something that requires a huge amount of resources. It requires time and dedication. And there's lots of people that want to engage to help Canada navigate both through this pandemic and also improve its global health standing. And so I think that we can move forward. And just in response, this will be my last point. We've talked about whether or not this means a trade-off with the feminist international assistance policy and feminist foreign policy. And I think that, you know, as a person that advocated strongly for a feminist lens in our foreign policy, I think that it is enormously beneficial on the world stage. I am disappointed that we have what I call a pedestal foreign policy rather than the feminist foreign policy being one pillar. And so I would argue that we can chew gum and walk at the same time, that feminist foreign policy and feminist international assistance policy is necessary, but it's not sufficient to chart our way forward to address global health challenges. So thanks very much.
That's great, Val. Thank you very much. Now, Nilima, earlier in the day, you presented some research that I think reflects not so well on Canada, and which helps put things in, perhaps put things in perspective. I think Canadians, before they really get exposed to global development, perhaps come at the issue with an assumption that we're already quite generous and that we're already quite globally minded, and that might act as a brake against us taking more on. And yet I believe that your research on how our government's been spending relative to the COVID pandemic suggests that that might not necessarily be the case. I'm wondering if you might be able to share some of those views and respond to some of what you heard from Roisin earlier. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ben, and thanks to all my fellow panelists for kicking this off. Funnily enough, you're asking me about the research findings, but I almost wanted to go into this and suspend my findings and try and present you with some questions which weren't tainted by those findings. So I can try and do a little bit of both. So I guess, for me, when I think about, what are the key questions that we could benefit from having the views of Canadians on relating to global public health, I too came to a kind of similar tripartite or four dimensions, if you will, to Roisin. So what I thought maybe I would do is present the 3/4 areas that I think might be relevant to ask Canadians, prefaced with maybe an initial remark on what my findings show, to give you a bit of both. So, building on Roisin's point about the narrative, I do think that there is a need to ask Canadians about what kind of narrative vision they want for their engagement on global public health. My own research has suggested that most donors, including Canada, have tended to focus on a relatively disease-specific focused approach to global public health, that there is a very biological framing to what we mean by global health, as opposed to a kind of, Richard Morton uses the words, a syndemic or a socially driven epidemic to describe COVID-19. And it would be interesting to understand whether Canadians see that as a problem or not. And, my own view, kind of building on what Val was saying, was we need this process to engage Canadians to demand a reset, because the bureaucracy isn't going to give us the reset otherwise. And that if we want to be bold and ambitious, we need a citizen-driven demand for that boldness and ambition, because bureaucratic cultures in Canada in particular tend to be quite conservative and risk-averse. And so some key questions that I think would be interesting to ask Canadians to try and see if they would like to demand that kind of ambition in their policy is, for example, should Canada be championing universal health care overseas? Which social determinants of ill health is the most important one to tackle? Is it gender? Do Canadians see gender as the major dimension that needs to be tackled when we think about health in a more broader based framing? So that would be sort of some questions which may be accessible to the average Canadian, that perhaps suspends my own biases and views on where that might go. On the second dimension, which was about finance, Roisin asked about how much finance has Canada provided to tackle COVID overseas. And so the estimates are about 1.14 billion, of which 704 million is roughly new resource, they say. So it's not reallocated resource. That is still less than 1% of its overall spend on COVID domestically. It's about less than 0.5% actually. And it still puts Canada in 12th position globally in terms of the share of its overseas COVID response compared to its domestic fiscal response. So it's not at the top of the league table, certainly, in terms of that investment. And concurrently, its investment on development aid more generally, Canada sits below the DAC average, which is 0.3% O to GNI. It sits at 0.227% O to GNI. So in terms of the kind of key questions in the finance space, I think, one important question is, what is the relative prioritization that Canada should be striking or aiming for on global public goods generally? If you think about the other global public good that we tend to talk about a lot, it's climate change. And so how does one balance? I mean, they might be positive sum in some cases, but they're not going to be positive sum in every case. So what is the relative prioritization between these global public goods? And what kind of financing do we want to provide to these channels? And then also, what percentage of ODA GNI are we willing to tolerate towards global public health specifically? Even if we know if that expenditure comes at the expense of domestic expenditure on global public health, on doctors and nurses here, on addressing homelessness in Canada. So there are these trade-offs. And I think looking at our overseas expenditures in light of what the domestic costs might be to understand where Canadians sit on that trade-off could be quite interesting. And then in terms of channels or modalities of engagement, I alluded to Canada's sort of very strong disease-based focus. And there is a preference for vertical standalone global funding mechanisms, the Global Fund, Gavi, and more recently, the ACT Accelerator. And I think Canadians need to be thinking about whether they want that type of channel, the focus on that type of channel, which tend to be very disease-focused and perhaps come at the expense of better funding for organizations like the WHO that have a much wider global public health mandate and maybe better able to make the case for a more a social kind of focus, an economic focus on the determinants of ill health. And I think also with the question about whether Canadians want us to be working with local level actors or Canadian NGOs as intermediaries is also a critical one in the global public health space. And just finally, just for one last thing that I was triggered on off the back of what Val said, which is this idea of trying to find out what Canada does, in the World Health Assembly. And I think there is an important issue around transparency. And I think, and I don't mean transparency necessarily just in the kind of freedom of information space, although I think that's problematic in the Canadian context as well, from everything I can see in terms of delays in the actual process of obtaining those kinds of requests or fulfilling those requests. But I think we very much have an insiders and outsiders world in the Canadian foreign policy space. And I think we need to think about how we can make outsiders more of an insider and insiders more engaged with outsiders. And so things like building these networks, these synergistic networks between researchers, civil society, and citizens, I think is critical. And I hope an exercise like this is going to further blur that insider-outsider binary so that we just understand better what we're doing and what we can do better. Thanks.
That's great. We do have actually quite a few questions already coming in from our attendees, but I wanted to start by giving each of you the opportunity to respond to what you've heard, Val and Regine. Go, Val. Over to you.
I just wanted to build off of what Nilima was saying, and as she was speaking, I was thinking about the role of power. And I think one of the things that we also need to engage with Canadians on is understanding the context in which we are engaging and understanding power dynamics, particularly with lower and middle income contexts. I used to work, when I was at Foreign Affairs Canada, I worked on HIV, and we used to talk about know your epidemic. And I think one of the things that tends to be problematic with Canada's approach to health right now is we have these priorities and we go into countries and we sell them what they need to do, rather than kind of working with national level actors and helping build connections with Canadian researchers and organizations in order for the prioritization to happen there. And so I think that we also need to recognize those power dynamics and recognize which side of that power dynamic Canada sometimes is on.
Regine?
Yeah, and I mean, fascinating talk, Nilima, and thank you so much for sharing the data, which I'm very interested to know how much of our spending nationally, like domestic spending on COVID, is being spent on abroad and as assistance abroad. And I think this, I kept thinking about the package of a global health strategy. What would Canada's global health strategy look like if it was a package of things or actions and modalities? And so development, it seems to me, is one of them. But then you need to have a bucket of diplomacy, and then you also need to have a bucket of national strategies for global health, right? So the national antimicrobial resistance strategy should be something that falls within a global health strategy. And so articulating that, again, the theme of transparency being really important, articulating that transparently to Canadians, that in a manner that is discussed and just, backed by Canadians, I think is really important. So I'd love to see all these, what has actually been discussed here being put together in a coherent global health strategy that that is Canada's own, right? And is kind of marched out abroad, but also here at home is viewed as valuable. So yeah, just the package, I think, is really, the whole thing is important to me.
That's great. Alice, I wonder, as you've been listening to this and imagining our exercise, once we have 400 Canadians that are a representative sample of our full national conversation, what your reactions are perhaps to the level of the conversation, the sort of balance between general principles and themes and details. Do you have any steer for us on the way that we're thinking about communicating all this to citizens based on your experience?
Well, I can certainly say that we can't talk about everything. And there's definitely so much that is top of mind for these types of, for this particular topic. And especially looking, browsing through some of the questions that are being asked right now, I think that with all the experts, and I know that there will be, at the start of this process, we'll be engaging more members as well to really understand what is close at heart right now, what do they think would be important for just general policy at a national level in Canada. I think we have to be very careful in ensuring that the proposals and topics that are selected can also be applicable and implementable, and not just aspirational. So a lot of the things we're talking about now, if we, for example, focus on something that's COVID related or this pandemic related, can it be generalizable for future issues? Can we have it think ahead for Canada in the future? Or do we want to be very specific, or maybe we need to be, if it's something like, the pandemic issue. But if we want to have more sustained policy with respect to global public health, what does that mean at a general level? And how is it going to be implemented? I think that we have to not only think about the issues and the proposals, but the follow through of it will be really important too, because putting together this process and engaging the 400 people, that the participants and citizens of Canada that will be a part of this process, we want them to feel like their voice matters, and their voice is going to shape foreign policy and issues facing Canada today and for the future. So I think keeping in mind what is important, but also implementable and actionable for all of us.
Great. In my experience working in policy inside government, it's you're only really having a serious policy conversation when you've got reasonable alternatives, or when you can imagine the opposite of what you're proposing also being viable. And so with that, I think I'd like to ask each of the three subject matter experts here, what would be the principal argument against increasing this focus on global public health? Or what would you imagine to be the sort of most reasonable, most informed pushback to say, well, that's not the right idea, that's not the right focus. I assume that no one's against health, but there's fixed resources. There's presumably a risk in spreading yourself too thinly across multiple different objectives. What would be the principal argument against that you could imagine, so that we can start to develop sort of two opposite options for each of the policy proposals we would put forward to citizens? Perhaps we'll go back in the same order, starting with that you originally presented, starting with Rougine and then Val and then Nilima.
Sure. So I think that's a really great question, and I think scope creep to me seems like something that might be the biggest argument for thinking about this a bit more critically and getting pushback from the idea of a global public health agenda in Canada. So global health, I'm going to just be very simple and say global health is a field that's that's, like, as I mentioned before, is all encompassing, and many things can, the deeper you go, the more you find that things impact health. And health is just one of those, so population health, the health of the world is one of those things that's impacted by so many sectors in operating at a global level, but then also operating at a national level. And just thinking through that will require a great deal of reset of resources, personnel. I view that if a global public health agenda is going to be done correctly, it needs to be done with a whole of government approach. And that whole of government approach will require expertise, as has been mentioned, an inordinate amount of thinking carefully around curating that approach. So to me, I think in addition to resources being obviously always on the table, the scope creep would be perhaps something that might be levied as an argument.
Thank you. What would you say, Val?
I would, and this is not something that I believe, so before people accuse me of being a rabid realist, I would say that there is an argument that could be made that this is an era, perhaps less so now because of the new emerging, or the president-elect in the United States, but this is an era of increased nationalism, where countries need to look after their self-interests. We saw in the COVID pandemic, particularly how vulnerable we were because of global supply chains. So we need to actually focus more of our resources here at home. Now, that's not that's not something that I would support, but that definitely is an argument that has been articulated within the kind of the health and foreign policy space.
Well, that sounds like that's what's already happening too. So that might actually be the best counterpoint is not what some rabid nationalist would say, but just the behavior of the government right now. I mean, the number that really struck me in Nilima's presentation is that we're only spending 0.5% of our entire response on COVID at the global public policy level. This is a global problem. It's a pandemic. And yet we're spending 99.5% of the resources inside our borders and only 0.5%. There seems to be something a little out of whack with the source of the problem, and presumably much of the solution as well. The vaccine more likely to be developed outside of Canada than inside of the distribution, the future waves coming from out of the country. That might be quite a useful framing right there. But let me turn to Nilima and see what her sort of counter argument, imagined counter argument might be to some of the arguments coming forward here.
Thanks, Ben. I think I have three potential arguments. The first being, if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, they are meant to be goals that are universally applicable, whether you're a wealthy country or you're a poor country, that there are domestic development challenges that we need to deal with. And so the argument could be levied that if Southern governments aren't investing in global health issues or health of their populations, why should we be doing the investing? Particularly if those countries are middle-income countries spending on getting scientists on the moon, for example, which has been some of the criticism of UK money going to India, for example. It's also seen to be a potential form of neocolonialism. And so those arguments could be levied in that space. I think I mentioned the second sort of argument, which was that there are other priorities globally that are equally as important, if you think about climate change, for example. Mm-hmm. And then I think lastly could potentially be an argument that our multilateral architecture for global health is wanting, that the WHO lacks legitimacy. Many view it as having failed in the context of its COVID response, rather than potentially realizing that the WHO's failures are actually its membership's failures. So I think that lack of legitimacy, though, of the WHO and of the kind of multilateral health architecture globally could potentially jeopardize any argumentation for greater investment through it.
Great. I think that's really helpful to sort of sharpen the potential debate there. Now, we do have quite a few questions. I'm going to ask the first one from our Q&A field from an anonymous attendee, but once we've got an answer to that, and by the way, Val, it's a question for you, just a heads up. Once we do that, I'll turn to both Irfan Fancy and Jim Cox, and we'll make sure that you can use your mics, and then you can choose which of the questions. Jim in particular asked us 3 or 4, so rather than having me pick, I'll ask Jim to pick. But let me start with the anonymous attendee who asked Valerie, where does the criticism of the Canadian government response to COVID-19 stop at the bureaucracy level and start at the political level? In what measure, in other words, do you think this is a technical problem as opposed to a political problem?
I think that it's both. And I think I've been beating the global health drum for a long time, both with the previous government and this government. And I think that a lot of people anticipated when the Trudeau government first came into power and they had articulated a Canada's back message, that we could anticipate a more robust presence on the world stage, and we didn't get that. Instead, I think we got a lot of pandering to domestic interests and articulated through foreign policy. So I would agree that it's a political problem. I think one of the reasons why I focus on the technical nature of it is to make it as apolitical as possible, because it's something that is too important for that sole political lens. So it is in a sense something that all political parties share. So it's political, but it's apolitical in nature, and it can be solved through robust kind of technical evidence-based action. So I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
Okay. Thank you, Val. That's great. I see that Jim has been added as a panelist so that he can ask a question. Over to you, Jim. I believe you're calling us from Ottawa. So if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. There we go.
Great, and thank you. I have often been concerned, annoyed, a variety of other words about the habit of wanting to carry out a lot of action in foreign policy in general, in other areas, and in health is one example of a lot of enthusiasm to actually become involved and start to carry out stuff, to do stuff. I haven't heard in any of these areas a statement of an objective at the start of the exercise. Is there any hope in Canada that we would be able to specify exactly sort of what our health objectives are in advance of talking about a variety of activity?
I might start kicking that off and answer that, Jem, if I may. We are proposing this rethink of Canada's foreign policy, I think, to break down some of the barriers or the structures that lead foreign policy to be where it is, and the way the government conceives it. We're coming at this as citizens, and one of the ways that we've conceived of this project is if we start from the foreign policy debate from what individual citizens need, that might be one way to perhaps bridge the gap between rhetoric and reality, or between words and action. So you'll see in the 3 themes that we've added to this foreign policy by Canadians exercise, we're talking about what's needed in terms of action to keep Canadians healthy, what's needed in terms of action to keep Canadians prosperous, and what's needed in terms of keeping Canadians safe. We'll see if there's that resonance when we bring in the representative sample of the population to see if linking foreign policy to something as tangible as health, prosperity, and security might be a way to reframe the discussion, a way to get more to concrete action, and to have the resources and the support for spending the resources commensurate with the objectives that we had. Do any of our co-panelists want to take a crack at Jim's question as well? All right, I do see we only have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to give Irfan Fancy a chance to answer if he's on. If not, I'll ask the question that he's typed into the Q&A field here, which is that nothing can move forward until we get this pandemic under control globally, not to mention the enormous cost that it carries, financial and social, among others, that we are incurring. Surely this and climate change should be our priorities now. That, of course, brings to mind the challenge, I think, that Nilima voiced just recently, which is that there are many global public goods that Canada presumably needs to fight for, and they might not necessarily all go together. There might actually be some trade-offs between the resources or the attention and the effort that we put to, say, stopping the next pandemic or other areas of global public health versus climate change. It might not necessarily be climate change and health. It might actually be, well, which of these two do you want to put at the center of your foreign policy? So I guess I would turn that question around by saying it's not necessarily about them both being priorities. That maybe what we need to do is to put different global public goods before Canadians in a bit of a menu and say, well, which is the one that you really want us to focus on? With that, let me see if I have any final comments or observations from our 4 panelists before we wrap it up and move on to our next series of topics on foreign policy by Canadians. Any final words of wisdom? Well, let me then explain the next steps in our process. We launched today, November 9. Over the course of November and December, we're going to have a series of thematic discussions. So I'll shout out to our Vancouver chapter, which will be kicking off a series of discussions on Canada and the global economy, starting on November 17th, with a conversation on energy and the global economy in particular, but there'll be a series of events hosted by both CIC Vancouver and CIC Victoria, contemporary challenges in the global economy, quite a lot dealing with the growing dominance of Asia in the global economy and how Canada's links to Asia remain quite a bit less than that they could have been if we're looking just in terms of our economic benefits. So there'll be a series of discussions on Canada's relationship with India, Canada's relationship with Japan, Canada's relationship with Indonesia. Hanging behind all of this, of course, a consideration of the rising superpower of China. Then on November 25th and November 26th, the Winnipeg branch of CIC will be hosting 2 days of virtual events on issues of security and looking at security in quite a broad lens. So there'll be panels on security in terms of defense and intelligence. There'll be panels on human security and defending against the threats that actually affect people at an individual level or the level of individual human dignity. There'll be questions of environmental security as well. That'll be November 25th and 26th. And then we have a series of events being planned on climate change with dates yet to be determined. These will all be open to the public. And so if you look to your CIC website or CanWatch or Global Canada, our partners, or our social media feeds, you'll see invitations to participate in those discussions. In January, we will be working with a polling firm, YouGov, that will develop a sample of 400 Canadians that are as exact a reflection of our country in all its diversity, geographic, ideological, gender, ethnicity, age, several other factors as well, so that we have essentially a microcosm of the Canadian nation that we will then invite to be briefed on these topics, put the questions to them that we are developing over these coming weeks, and then have them deliberate over the course of probably 2 days to see where the people of Canada would land on these issues of global engagement, so that we can take our cues from the citizens of our country, and then we will be interpreting and providing some kind of final report of that to feed that back into the policymaking process, so that we can reshape the way that Canada's foreign policy is imagined, defined, and delivered. That is Foreign Policy by Canadians. Thanks to everyone for a successful launch event today. Thanks for all of you that are online with questions. We look forward to having you involved throughout the months to come. And thank you to our experts who joined us. We look forward to working with you as we refine the questions that we'll put to citizens. Have a great day, everyone. Now with that, can we turn to Elizabeth for some final remarks about this the successful day that the National Capital Branch has organized.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And I listened with great intent to this past discussion, and look forward to what comes out of it. I'd like to thank everybody, all the participants, those who were also part of the general public who came to listen to the various panels today. I'd like to thank you all for having been part of this very important exercise. It's thanks to these discussions that you will help us to create a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities for Canada on the world stage. It's important that Canada on the global stage speak with one consistent voice, and through the review of Canada's foreign policy, we look towards a strategic determination of Canada's foreign policy. And the most complex part of this program, as I was saying, was the manner in which the speakers on your panel wove all the key points discussed during the day and will form the discussion guide. This and other discussion guides emerging from other GAP events to be hosted by the other branches will play a significant role in the next phase, which will focus on the deliberative democracy exercise. This final step is designed to lead to foreign policy options that reveal preferences by the Canadian electorate on Canada's global engagement. And as Alice had said, to create a balanced and accurate vetted information based on our discussions, that options that can in turn be implemented realistically. I offer thanks to those who have partnered with us today, namely CanWatch and Global Canada. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the International Development Research Center for their ongoing support of the work of the National Capital Branch, as it looks to engage Canadians on the value of international development cooperation. And in closing, I'd like to thank Ben Rowswell, our national president, as well as the national office, and especially Daniel Lees, for all the support that we had received. And I'd also like to thank the National Capital Branch board members who have worked tirelessly to put this event on. And I'd like to recognize in particular Hamid Georgiani, our program director, Caroline Shimeda, our communications lead, and Sam Amua, who has been our technical, I call him the guru. He really is amazing, and he's been there for us, as have Hamid and Caroline at every turn. So I really thank them for all that they have done. Ben has highlighted the upcoming events for the other branches in CIC Vancouver and Victoria and Winnipeg, and so I would urge you to look at the CIC website and other media platforms to follow these events as they unfold. And thanks again for your participation in this important event. This exercise is all about you, about exercising your voice and expressing your opinions. And on behalf of the National Capital Branch of the CIC, I would like to thank you for doing so. And I wish you all a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care now.